Hello, and welcome to the Wolf Den podcast, your home for competitive TCG news and discussions. I'm your host, Zenitsu, joined today by my special co-host, RideMyAvatar.
What's up, Digidestins?
And this week, we will be discussing the lesser decks of the meta and how they find success in the current EX3 environment. Listen to us on your favorite podcasting networks. Find us at Wolf Den Digimon TCG. This is also going to be streamed live over on Twitch over at twitch.tv/Zenitsu and uploaded on the YouTube channel of Zenitsu.
And if you want to catch out a shameless plug-in of RideMyAvatar, definitely go check me out. I do a lot of Digimon content from deck profiles similar to Zenitsu's, and do a lot of meta discussions on my channel as well through JP's format. So hopefully we can cover some decent topics today.
So we'll first off start with the viewer question of the week, and the viewer question of the week is, why does Bandai only restrict it to one or outright ban cards? Why is there no other limited quantities? So to lead this off, I think it has to do with just the easeability of just remembering, hey, this card is still playable, but it's only playable at one, or this card is not playable, therefore it just doesn't exist. So it could be just an ease of access kind of thing, because Yu-Gi-Oh's notorious for doing, oh, this is limited, semi-limited, banned, and it's just a mess to memorize. So this is a little bit easier. Plus, if they're going to hit a card, they really want to hit a card. So I have a little philosophy that I believe in, which goes to card quantities and why you put certain card quantities in. 4 is you want to see that card as much as you possibly can. 3 is you want to see it at least once per game. 2 is you want to occasionally see it, hopefully when you need it. And 1 is you want to rarely see it because it's still needed, but not super needed. And limiting it to 1 puts it into that last category. So that way the chances of actually seeing it are greatly reduced.
Yeah, to an extent. Usually that's usually a Magic philosophy in itself, is that count for seeing it all the time in the opening hand. The others are just basically normal chain and events that you would see in Magic's terminology. Outside of that, it's just, I don't think it's just for ease, because if they went routes that would just make it make sense, I think they're just nervous on putting too many copies, because they're, even in their other card games, they haven't really ever done, it's either ban or one. It's just been their kind of forte. If I remember correctly, even in their DBZ, I think it's just either banned or rotted, or, one of copy as well.
Yeah, different companies have different styles and approaches on how they ban and restrict their games. So this just is Bandai's current method on how they have been doing things with some of their other games and currently are doing things. So that's kind of that. But to get into the meat and potatoes of the actual episode, let's talk about some of the lesser meta decks. So these are basically just what I would define as like the tier 3 and rogue category. So they're just decks that can do well, but statistically don't do well for various different reasons. It could be their overall power, it could be their play rate, it could be the pilot. There's just lots of factors that go against them, but they still manage to find some levels of success.
Oh, very true. Especially since everybody just doesn't want to just play the tier 1 deck, and especially with the Ulti Cups, if I remember correctly, they did legalize mulligan rules for the Ulti Cup. So that does skew a little bit of the data, because if your deck gets pushed ahead because of the mulligan, that's a big difference than normally playing without it.
And this first deck that we're going to bring up definitely is super favored with mulligans in terms of just its sheer construction and how it kind of functions, which is going to be Dorbicmon. So in the last event, which was the Carta Magica event in 10th place, there was a Dorbicmon player who ran a Dorbicmon OTK deck and obviously found some decent amount of success with it. As far as what the deck was doing, it wasn't doing any Gammamon shenanigans that some people really like, about using Dorbicmon as that deck's level 6. This was straight up just, let me just play dragons in the deck. They have almost nothing to do with anything. Evolution is thrown out the window, and I'm just going to straight up hard play Dorbicmon and punch as hard as I humanly possibly can.
Which is the general idealism for this deck. But as you can see, definitely they did tech in some of the Dorbicmon stuff, which, well, I mean, the Gammamon stuff, you have like Kaus Gammamon and Kanos Wisemon being a way of adding that unblockable, especially against like the blue deck of Metal Garurumon that has a blocker ability. If you can sneak that in, that can really apply some punishing aspects, because now you can deal with their board state, but also get around that blocker.
Yeah, so for those who are unfamiliar with what Dorbicmon actually does, it is a rare from EX3, and he natively has the rush ability, so the turn you play him, you can attack right away. And then he has the Digicross ability, where you could shove up to 5 dragons, like anything with dragon in its type, so this does include Dragonkin, Ceratopsians, and Soars. So it has a wide amount of cards that just interact with it, and the fact that the Digicross just reduces the play cost by 2 for each one you shove under makes him a level 6 that you could hard play for 3 with a full stack. And you're ideally trying to use that stack to be able to basically just kill the opponent the turn you hard play him for 3. So the deck runs a couple of memory fixing tamers to ensure that you're going to be at 3. So it's running 2 memory boosts, 1 tie, and 2 heroes. So the tie is just for more damage. The heroes is for extra DP, because there's no real way the deck is trying to gain DP outside of Jazzardmon. Yeah, Jazzardmon's the only actual way it's trying to gain DP. Outside of Agumon, because he is a reptile, so that doesn't exactly work there. So it does need the hero to gain some extra DP to ensure your Digimon's going to be as strong as it possibly can. Then the deck is literally just full of random
draw advantages.
Yep, it's full of some extra draw advantages. Again, red memory boost being a good one to help search out your red pieces. It's running 3 Heroes of the Skies, so that way it's literally just the draw 2. It cares about nothing else, because nothing else matters. It's just 2 mana, or not 2 mana, 2 memory, draw 2. And for that same reason, it's running 3 Fireballs, so that way it's just trying to draw into all of its pieces and get the hand set up for your big Dorbicmon play. Then the only other option is a Delicate Plan to turn off options in security. That might be a problem for Dorbicmon.
Well, usually they're just trying to survive and push against Setcon, because if they're walking into that minefield, they need at least some sort of protection, because they look like they play enough security gainer effects, but you know how that goes. If there's something deadly in the option, Dorbicmon just goes bye-bye.
Yeah, and this deck is mostly focused around gaining Security Attack Plus. So you have at least a couple different instances and ways to gain Security Attack Plus. One off of the Taikamiya, one off of the 4 copies of Greymon. It's running 2 copies of Jazzarichmon from EX3 for, again, more Security Attack Plus. Master Tyrannomon for some more Security Attack Plus. And then at least 3 copies of that, and then 2 copies of Volcanic Dramon. To, again, just have more Security Attack Plus. So it's very easy for this deck to have like 4 instances of Security Attack Plus underneath all of his stuff. And then it's running Majiramon for that multi-attack potential to be able to then line up your big swing, punch all of the opponent's security away, and then, oh hey, look, he restood and now he's swinging for game.
Yeah. It has possibility there. I don't see that actually. I think it was just a spicy tech. I don't think it actually came up enough for it to justify, especially how everybody plays in the raising area now in OTK. I think it was just hopefully like,
well, the multi-attack Yeah, the multi-attack works if there's no Digimon on their field at all.
Hmm. Okay. That
Yeah,
definitely
that's
works.
the weird thing with Majiramon's inheritable, because a lot of these like source stripping cards and cards that require no inheritables on the field want a Digimon on the field, but he's one of the few cards where his ability triggers even if there's no Digimon on the field, because his ability is checking if there's any inheritables, period.
Hmm.
And if there's none, then you still get the benefit of his effect.
Okay. Then realistically, he came up more often than not. Then. Okay.
Yeah,
That works.
and then, as Ride mentioned, the Kauskamamon and the Kano Weissmon just makes your Digimon basically unblockable, which is pretty good. And then I don't exactly know why they have the starter deck Guilmon. That doesn't necessarily
It's
make a whole lot of sense to me. Oh,
it's
on
for
delete
it
draw
when
card.
you, yeah, since you're gonna blow up most things, you will be getting that draw value. So it's just there for that free little draw value, and especially if you get the Guilmon X underneath it, Guilmon X can at least delete one of your opponent's 3,000 DP. So if they had to do a search rookie, that's a free draw out of it. So I
Okay,
mean, there's possibilities behind
yeah,
it.
I see. It's kill control and draw. Cuz it's like, "Oh, you're sitting on what's the god, Psychmon. They're sitting
Yeah.
on Psychmon, Solarmon, or Chikurimon. Cool. Raise out Guilmon, Digivolve into Guil X, draw a card, delete your Digimon, and then I can swing. And draw a card
Yep.
because of Gigimon. Okay, that makes sense then. But yeah, the name of the game is just draw.deck. The only other card that we didn't mention was Burning Greymon, and Burning Greymon's just the hybrid finish. Like, you broke off 5 security, you have a tamer sitting on the field, what else are you going to do?
Well, as long as you have the memory to do it, since you're going to be playing at 3 most of the time, you would have to really hope that you have the red memory boost on board to actually just go into Burning Greymon very easily.
Yep, and they're using Burning Greymon specifically because he is a dragon.
Yep.
So,
And he also kills, so that's not a bad trade off.
yeah, because if you need to digivolve like into Greymon and then go Greymon into Burning Greymon, like you still have some ability to climb, even though it's not like the greatest inconsistencies, but it gives you something.
Yeah. Or if you had to do double Burning Greymon on top of one another for that Guilmon after you've used up your Guilmon X, it's another possibility of just popping a 5k Digimon, which is most champions at that point.
Yep. We don't know this player's particular matchups, but I think like it is playing to the strengths of what basically BT9 was doing. This is BT9 3.0 for the most part, because nothing is better than BT9, and the kneecapping of um, what we did get in BT10 really just changed how we approach this format versus how Japan did. Um, so it's just literally an OTK deck. It's playing to the strengths of an OTK deck. Just wait until you see all your pieces and then just go off. So I think that's where it's finding some pretty decent success. Is just literally just that, just being another OTK deck.
Well, also the Mulligan definitely helped this deck out because your goal is to at least get to Dorbicmon by a certain turn, or else you're kind of just dead in the water. So being able to Mulligan the 5 if you don't see Dorbicmon in your opening hand, that can get you closer to a Dorbicmon, especially if you can set up your deck. That 5 cards you're putting at the bottom of your deck, reorder them in a way that will benefit you that way.
Yep, that is true. You're mainly just looking for Dorbicmon, and everything else is like superfluous. You just need the ability to play him, and that's kind of it. So, I definitely think the mulligans do help this deck out quite a lot.
Mm-hmm.
But going over one of the other spicier decks, jumping ship to something that popped up at the beginning of the format, which is Gallantmon. So
Okay.
I know. Gallantmon for the most part is just kind of I saying it's an OTK deck would be wrong. It has the ability to OTK.
It's
Um,
never been an OTK deck. It
but
is
yeah,
a definitely
it's
a
never
control
been an
deck.
OTK deck. So you could lead the charge on this one, Ride.
So with Gallantmon itself, we kind of know that certain pieces were just okay at best, and the problem was you you couldn't play the game the normal way. You had to wait for your opponent to be you had to be more reactive to what your opponent was doing, and that was the major disadvantage of Galamon X. Why it did so well in Japan was had to be because the way that they played a little more aggressively. Galamon a bit abused that, but especially when EX3 dropped, we gained a little new card in the form of War Growlmon, and that's when Digivolving trashed the top three cards of both players' decks. That if either player has 5 or more cards in their trash, you may play one Guillemon or Tocado from your hand or trash without paying the cost. So this gave you access to your Tocado, which was always a problem because if you had to hard play your Tocado, you were losing momentum and giving your opponent way too much memory that was just burning you. Now having the ability of now using your Tocado, or if you already had a Tocado out, you could grab a Guillemon that might search you out a piece or set you up for your next evolutionary line. But also having the ability to disrupt your opponent in a way that your opponent wasn't really ready for. Because again, we're in a game that loves to brick itself just a tad bit. And if you mill out another piece or two that they needed, they might be falling behind yet again.
I would definitely concur with the statement being on the receiving end of a Gallantmon list. And even though I was able to beat it, it was still actually surprisingly scary and very effective when it was doing all of its plays. I definitely think that the inclusion of the new War Growlmon is insane. Um, just because the big thing that it was lacking was the setup, and this is literally just the setup piece that it was waiting for. Especially since getting 5 cards in either player's trash is not hard. The deck likes to delete things, so whether you're using your cards or the opponent's using their cards, 5 is not hard. Um, and then
No,
out,
not at all.
yeah, and then Takato giving Blitz. If you do play the Takato is absolutely insane, and if you already have a Takato set up, another play that I think is like super spicy is using the Warp Guilmon to then be able to warp right away. You won't be able to attack because it doesn't have rush, but just still, it's a very powerful maneuver that the opponent might not be anticipating.
Well, at that point you wouldn't really be trying to do the Warp Guillemon because of the fact is that your opponent would have to be at a level 6, and at that point you're just better off just going out Gallantmon X antibody just to blow the level 6 out of the water because you're not going to burn yourself for that Guillemon. You would definitely set it up, but you would not waste your Digi Evolution for that, especially if you just went War Growlmon. You would definitely go for the Gallantmon X play, especially if you had the X antibody underneath it. Instantly now you're punishing your opponent so greatly with that.
Yeah, and for the most part, this is just another X antibody deck. X antibody decks, since they came out in BT9, they've been doing insanely well just because of the cycling on the levels. So this deck is another deck that takes advantage of like, oh, here's a level 3, here's a second level 3, here's a level 4, here's a second level 4. Just to be able to cycle itself. This particular version isn't using Cool Boy, but it is using X Antibody, and it is using Omnimon X in complements to the Gallantmon Crimson mode. And it's basically just a very solid list that can control a lot of what the opponent can do.
Which really interesting to see that we only saw this is the only Gallantmon that topped, and that's just probably because of just opponents know how changed up after the first event. Usually these kind of decks sneak in very easily when it's the first major event because most people don't know what decks do, are questioning effects and stuff like that. So again, decks can very easily squeak in on these kind of rogue events. especially at the beginning of the meta. And then once we're in like tournament 4 to 5, we kind of just see a stabilization of what we're going to expect.
Which is where we're hitting right now, and we kind of covered that last week. Because we've had 4 to 5 events to like really figure out what's actually good and why. And even though this deck can perform, maybe with some fine tweaking, it could sneak back into top 16s again. But it's just one of the weaker X antibody decks, which is unfortunate for it. But at least a lot of these newer tools and pieces that are coming out makes it still relevant and possible, which is kind of the whole highlight of this episode. Is like, even though these decks aren't necessarily commonly seen, they still can top, and just because it's not like within that tier 1, tier 2 echelon doesn't mean it doesn't deserve to have any recognition.
Well, yeah, but also this again, these decks we're covering right now, if you take these to locals, which are usually 3 to 4 men round, this deck will definitely get you there. Like, there's no questions about it. It's a lot less longer games and stuff like that, and a lot less mental capacity to go for 8-9 rounds. Usually once you start reaching that, that's usually starts getting fatigued by players. That's where they start making misplays and stuff like that. So stuff like that really does make or break a deck's ideology. But if you take these to locals, you should be quite fine.
Yeah, like you want to always prepare your decks for the different environments that you're expected to play in. Obviously, going 8-9 rounds, or even 7-8-9 rounds, you want to build your deck to cover as wide of a field as you possibly can, tailoring towards that tier 1, tier 2 echelons to be able to handle what you are generally expected to see more of. And then, like, you still just can have a decent amount of flexibility based on the type of deck that you're going to be bringing and who you're expecting to face and what you want to hopefully see. Which is why, shifting gears to yellow hybrids for a hot minute, yellow hybrids actually has been doing well. Has it been like doing exuberantly well? No, it got one high ranking. I think it got like a second place once, and then every other time we've seen it, it's always been very bottom of top 16. This could be due to the records. As we like to talk about, this is a slower deck. It tends to go to time a lot more because it is a recover stall based deck, so that contributes to that tie, which actually could sometimes work in its benefits when it comes to tiebreakers forming top 16s, which is why it's usually always at the bottom, is because it's usually like maybe X, like 0,
X1-1.
Yeah, X1-1, where it won the rest of the games, lost once, and then tied once, versus X and 2, which is a little bit worse than that tie. So
ties give you 1 point in this game, so that's better than a loss any given day of the week. But if you get 2 ties, it's just basically you kind of just got a double loss.
yeah,
So that's not really worth it.
and especially if you are looking to get first place the second you get a tie, that mentally is basically a loss, because now you locked yourself out of the ability to actually win the event. So,
yeah, but top 16 is your goal at that point.
yeah, I mean, top 16 is always a pretty good consolation. Especially depending on the event. Ultimate Cups, if you can get one tie and then never lose, like, you're in a very good position.
Yes.
But as far as what is making these yellow hybrid decks tick, it's essentially Venusmon. Venusmon is the lifeblood of these decks. It was the lifeblood over in Japan, with Jet Selfiemon being one of the most egregious and abusable cards to be able to get all the way up into your level 6, which was Venusmon, and then basically shut the opponent out from their abilities, which shuts them out from playing a lot of their deck. And these decks farm Garurumons, because, like, Garurumon only has one instance of Security Attack Plus, and because it has that Security Attack Plus, it can't attack into Venusmon, so Venusmon just becomes a very safe card to just sit on the field, and the hope Garurumon literally can't do anything about it. Most of the time it can't. And it even shuts off a lot of its like potential aggro plays because it turns off the Wind Digivolving ability the second it goes into Wear X. Um,
But it doesn't shut off the ability to bounce something, but it shuts off that restand, which was the free value that it needed, and it doesn't gain blocker, which is really what your goal is with Venusmon anyway, is to make sure that they don't restand. And that's huge, especially since most of their Wind Digivolving effects are that is just restand this XYZ. Um, the only time it doesn't matter when you start swinging in with it is if you're on when this is facing the Were Garurumon, that just gets the free restand anyway. As long as you don't overexert, you should be kind of decent there. But that's just kind of how that goes.
and similarly to security control, like it is kind of luck based in terms of what the security it is. It doesn't necessarily care as much what the security is because most of the time they're only running a very small handful of options because that's what the deck space they have left gives them. So they're usually running like the one Sunrise Buster that they're now able to run. Um, they would run more if they could, but they can't. And then
That
it's just going to
restriction one
be
was well deserved.
yeah, and then it's going to be either Wyvern's Breath or Lone K Ariscado in order to act as that big hard removal. So when a deck like Metal Garurumon moves out, realizes it actually can't kill you, that's when Venusmon slash Yellow Hybrids is like, okay, kill your Mon through DP reduction because I can do that, and then I just am going to slowly recover. There are two variants of the deck to take note of. There's going to be the Rise package, where you're using Rise Greymon X and Rise Greymon in some capacity. It's just, I'll label this as yellow red. And then there is going to be the other package, which is going to be using a splash of blue for Shakumon in order to have access at more recovery. Because the thing that Jet Sylphie was doing was unrestricted recovery. Shakumon is the closest thing that they have to that as just a generic Digivolve and recover. So their timer lineups will slightly differ depending on which variant you're running, but for the most part, it's just your same average tamer suite that we've been seeing since, what, BT7?
Hard facts there.
But yeah, the Rapidmon techs are still all in. Some of the decks are including Pillowmon as the yellow floodgate. So Pillowmon shuts off free playing Digimon by card effects. So this does really well into decks like Jessmon. This does really well into decks like Bloomlord. It just shuts off a lot of their potential to just go wide. And that's another huge aspect to being able to counter this meta is just being as prepared for multiple different decks as you possibly can. So you have the Venusmon to shut off the Garus, and then you have the Pillows to shut off the Jessmons and the Hydras. So it's in a pretty decent position meta-wise to be able to tackle two of the greater threats of this meta in order to find some
I was about to
success.
say what Jessmon, because Jessmon has yet to top in any existence or form.
Don't remind me. Jessmon was positioned to be so good.
It's still good. It tops many locals very easily, but the problem comes down to once it starts getting into later rounds. Fatigue takes in and all that fun jazz. And again, the deck is a big thought process deck. Same thing with Bloom Hydra. That's why a lot of players don't like it because, again, you have to think and process. If you don't do your chain right, you get punished, and it's very easily super punished.
Yeah, and a deck like Yellow Hybrids is definitely less thought process intensive. It's more thought process intensive than security control. You're at least playing tamers, killing Digimon, and evolving. So you're at least doing one more thing than what the Yellow Hybrid players would be doing. So it is definitely a harder deck to pilot, and it's okay into security control. I don't think it has the damage output it really needs most of the time in order to actually close out games against security control. So you do have to be very mindful of that matchup if you're thinking about taking the style of deck. So teching in some Susanomons, and this is why I like the Rise package a little bit more. because Rise Greymon at least gives security attack +1 if you're using the yellow one. So there is a little bit of a punch factor. But it's definitely a very flexible and versatile deck depending on how you want to build it and what you want to gain out of it.
Yes, very true.
So as far as some of the other decks,
Let,
outside of the
let,
two variants,
we should probably go talk about the Masti girl.
Mastimon?
Yeah.
Yeah, okay. So Mastimon was a bit of a surprise. It reared its head a couple of times in the lower top 16s, which is still good because most of these top 16 records is literally going to be like X and 1, X and 2, or more commonly right now, X1 and 1. So, the fact that Mastimon has done it a couple of times is a good sign that it is still a good deck. Even though it
Yeah.
got like 0 updates for now, uh, BT11 is coming. Don't worry.
It just added a little splash of Death X, just because.
Yeah, but the fact that Mastimon can still do pretty well, and we even saw an Imperial top, and Imperial was doing literally the same thing it was doing since EX2 with a splash of Death X in just because. Um,
Yeah. The highest top so far has been sixth place on PPG's event earlier in the format. Like we like I said earlier in discussion, I did mention that it gets a little bit when it's like the first early format before we get to the like fifth event. It's a lot of people get really spicy and saucy with it, what they're doing. So, and it throws people off because they don't expect it or don't understand the matchup. And that just kind of comes with the territory.
yeah, as we've seen in some of the event data, that there was more of like a consolidation of decks that were being played towards the later parts of the meta. And I think right now we only have one event left on the docket, which is going to be this weekend, and that's going to be the Play TCG Regional.
I'm
So
going to be quite honest with you. I don't see much of a big turnout in that event.
well, I mean, I resigned. I was originally going into there thinking it was going to be an Ultimate Cup. Um, and then they announced it wasn't. So I'm just like, oh, I already have my invite. I could play it out, but I felt like I would just be stealing the slot of somebody else who could use that opportunity to try to get their invite. I really didn't need the prizing. Sure, I could have sold it, but again, I didn't need to. And surprise, it's actually my work weekend. So I was like, oh, I actually physically might not even be able to play. So there was just a lot of compounding factors for me personally why I resigned from that. But if it was an Ultimate Cup, I was definitely going to try to make it.
Definitely, definitely. Um, but now with that Ulti Cup restriction going into a regionals, that means the mulligan is changed. So we might see a little bit different on results this weekend too, which might lead to seeing a little less of Metal Groomon X, but we'll have to see.
Yep. But as far as Mastimon, it really isn't doing anything we haven't seen before. They still sometimes will splash in Ordainimon for some cute tech, just because it's very easy to get 2 level 6s out with this deck, considering Mastimon ideally is going to res a level 5. Creepymon also can res a level 5. They still sometimes use Creepymon. It's just a very tech heavy deck to where you could just figure out ways to be able to play your cards to put yourself in the best type of position, and then Mastimon being a very steamrolly deck can start dominating from that point forward.
Yeah, it's a very mid-range kind of style of play. It just able to control and apply pressure at the same times is what really makes this deck feel great, especially against high aggro decks. Usually the mid range can keep it in check a little bit.
Yeah, purple, even though the Calling from the Darkness did get restricted to 1, most decks weren't playing more than 1 anyway, so it's not like this deck really felt that. And I think like the Carta Magica list that we're looking at, the 15th place, uh, does have some pretty decent tech in here. So you have Black Gallantmon for some extra aggro. You have Candlemon, which I know a lot of lists dropped, but the fact that like Candlemon can help you gain some extra memory because it is playing the Maycrackmons, which Maycrackmon, if you know you're not going to use Ordainimon, like just throwing away Ordaini is still pretty good. And that turns all of your other 2 colors into like decent value engines too for Maycrack. So like there's just a lot of different tech cards in here to really help the deck's overall flow, especially like Underworld's Call. In case it wants to be discarded, then it's just a free draw, or you use it to revive the Black Gato when you have enough memory, and like it just cascades in on itself to just value town.
Yeah. Again, this Mastimon's gonna get a real massive overhaul when it comes down to BT11. So, looking at certain key pieces like the Lady Devi, the Angelwolmon from BTO from the starter deck, Mastimon, Odenimon, Death X, Odenimon Fall Down mode, Chaos Degradations, Flame Health Scythes, maybe a TK Arkari, and then, Psychmon Gaze are just going to be staples in the deck that just stay long term. Lucamon Chaos mode and Gatomon as well, but the rest kind of just fall off because the new stuff and with the Mirai is going to definitely change up the list quite a lot.
Yeah, because essentially what Mako is trying to do is what Mirai is going to be doing, where it's just like Mako is a good consistency tool for the deck currently, and it helps you gain some memory for using your 2-color Digimon, but like the idea is to just use it to try to help make your cards more efficient to set up yourself to DNA, and the new Tamer coming out definitely just auto does it for you while just flat out gaining you memory. So it just is making the deck look a lot stronger, and being able to have the ability to top right now just puts yourself in a really good position to prepare yourself for the next evolution of that deck, which I think is something that a lot of people aren't necessarily thinking about is how do I put myself in the position to best be prepared for the next format, because there tends to be some weird power spiking in between certain sets. We thought that there was going to be a power spike between BT9 and BT10. There wasn't. The real power spike is going to be from BT10 slash BT9 into BT11, which isn't necessarily like that crazy. But being able to understand what your deck is trying to do right now helps you prepare for the new stuff when you're going to be implementing it in the future, which is probably a huge advantage to a lot of Gallantmon players, because for whatever reason, they always get support like literally every other set, like Machine Dramon. Even though those decks traditionally don't do well, they'll eventually get enough tools to be able to do well. And Mastimon is one of those decks where it's like it might not always get support, but this is a unique position where it can do well if you prepare yourself.
Well, the next 3 sets are just going to be Gallantmon fandom.
Oh my god, yeah.
If you're a Gallantmon fan, pray for your wallet, because I swear it's not going to look pretty at the end of it.
I mean, it's nice that Gallantmon just keeps getting support. I like it when Bandai just keeps giving decks support, to be honest, because it makes you
There's a
feel
point.
it makes you feel special. Like, oh, they remember my deck. Says the
Seven
player.
support.
Yeah.
7 support later. Let's stop giving decks that has over supported and they're topping just fine. Let's give some love to these underrated decks, please. Especially, Diaboromon, because he's like dying for support and he's on life support, please.
No. They got to give more Agumon support. Agumon is clearly not supported enough. Clearly.
I don't know. Let's see. We got the black Agumon. We got the red Agumon. We got the snow Agumon. We got the pink dinosaur. Like we're getting a Agumon every other set. It's like, come on. Like, we don't need this. We really didn't need this. We didn't need this. We didn't need a reboot of this set. Come on.
Although it is kind of interesting that Gallantmon hasn't been doing as well as Wargreymon X, but I think that's mostly just because of the meta shift away from tamers. So there's just less attention on the use of Gallantmon and Black Wargreymon, just because its defensive tools are okay. They're not great or anything, but something that was kind of doing well defensively is Examon. Um, a lot of people kind of wrote Examon off as more of a fun casual deck, but I think
It
against
still is.
I think against specific OTK decks, it's actually insane. Because like if you think about the goad mechanic and ability that Slayerdramon has, like it just kills OTK decks under specific circumstances where it's just like, oh, here's a Grandis play. Move out level 5. Okay, moved out level 5, Slayerdramon, kill your level 5 on your turn. Well, I didn't want or anticipate that, so I'm gonna go in my corner and cry now. And even against like Wargreymon, same thing. I'm gonna move out my level 5. Cool, Slayerdramon, kill your level 5. Like as long as you could set up before they move out, usually Examon is in a pretty good position against most OTK decks. I know for a fact specifically the Carta Magica Examon list. He went up against 5 Metal Gurumons and beat all 5 Metal Gurumons. Similarly to how the topping PPG list for Wargreymon X, he faced 4 Gurumons. So, like, if you just are able to see lots of Gurumons, that could, and your deck is good against it, that could really propel your deck in a good position in order to do very well at these events.
Well, let's don't forget he also played the magical blue hybrid for some reason.
Uh, early rounds, you can face some wild stuff in these large events. I'll just say that.
Round 3.
Round 3 is still within that, like, I know I'm gonna drop, but I have to play this out anyway phase. So, like, I still think even, like, after round 3 is when I think the jank kind of just slowly goes away. Um, but, yeah, like,
Like, not to discredit his playing ability, but he had like the dream climb, especially seeing 5 Metal Gurumon X's. He didn't see any of his bad matchups, which Examon does have quite a few.
oh, against security control specifically, it just bodies Examon.
Yeah. And then you have like other decks that just, don't get me wrong, a lot of people misunderstand like the Slayerdramon Examon kind of shenanigans. You can, because of how he's worded, he is a valid target because he's suspended. So you can swing into him. Some players didn't realize that because they think he restands first. But because you're the turn player and you're forcing them to attack because you're not the turn player, your restand doesn't happen until he declares target. So Slayerdramon is still a valid target. So is Examon. As long as they didn't have like Evader going for them, usually you can get rid of the Slayerdramon quite easily.
Yeah, and I think that's like a huge thing that certain players might not want to pick up the deck because it does have its own set of intricacies and interactions that you really have to be mindful of on how they work in order to be able to get the most out of your cards and understand how to be able to play the deck against other decks.
Well, also, it don't go burr.
It can though. Swing restand on Examon and Slayer. That's 4 attacks right there. Granted, you're throwing every caution out the window and every form of defense you have away. But like, if you need to just dump damage and you have that set up, like it can still dump damage, especially with a breaker underneath to be able to. Especially with a breaker underneath to be able to just like burn the opponent, like it's still pretty good.
Oh yeah, definitely. But it's still not the OTK go burr status. That's a lot of people's stick right now. Is if you look at it, a lot of the more complicated antiquities.
Intricacies.
Yeah, all the very much big 5-headed brain play decks aren't doing as well, and that's just because a lot of players just want simplistic go burr, and you'll see people pick up Grandis before they'll pick up the Bloom Hydra deck, because it's a lot simpler. They're both evenly matched, but it's making the right calls at the right time really pays off on certain players' play styles.
But interesting enough, speaking of Grandis, similarly to Jessmon, we haven't really seen Grandis be very successful this format. I know like it does have some good and some bad matchups. Garurumon is definitely not one of its greatest matchups. But it's still a pretty okay matchup. It's at least 50-50 being an OTK deck versus an OTK deck. I guess like against the field, it just isn't doing as well because Garurumon's doing pretty hot and security control is also pretty high up there. So with security control being more prevalent, that could keep certain OTK decks that don't necessarily tech for it or have the ability to tech for it, keeps them shut down for the most part. And a Grandis player isn't going to start splashing in red because that makes them worse into the Garurumon matchups. So it's like, what do I do? I can't tech. You can't always tech for everything.
No, not at all. But also, I think people are still not happy with Grandis and how bad tasting it was in their mouth because it was projected to be like the best, the deck to beat in the format, and it really had not that greatest top record. And I think a lot of people either tossed it for going into Bloom Hydra, and then how players get when a deck starts not playing how they want to, they're going to drop that as well. So I feel like they traded in their Grandis for Bloom Hydra and then realized that Bloom Hydra is just not what they were expecting. And that's just going to really hurt them more than they wanted to.
I mean, like, it also kind of goes into, like, the rock, paper, scissors of the format, where it's just like right now, Bloom Hydra is a better meta deck than Grandis. We do have statistics for that, showing that it is just better. But on top of that, like, looking forward, was Grandis that bad of a deck in reality? Because if everyone's right now afraid of the potential of Wargrey X antibody, or Black Wargreymon X antibody more specifically, and that deck just eats it alive because it's a good matchup. So certain decks can just come and go based on matchups and where the current meta state is. So that's like the big takeaway with all of these lesser decks is the fact that like just because they're down doesn't necessarily mean they're out.
No. And maybe for longer events, you don't take them, but like for the shorter local run, you'll definitely do great with them. There's never a chance on that. And especially because your locals, so your deck modifies to your locals experience very easily. But when it comes down to larger events, you can't prepare for everything. Where, I mean, you could spend the first couple seconds is that you can just go like, oh, 1, 2, 3, 4. Oh, I know there's going to be security con players today. Well, they're teching in so many of them. Well, let me go modify my deck real quick to put in these cards. That's usually the big thing.
Right, and in big events, consistency is king, and Grandis is one of the less consistent OTK decks of the X antibody variety, just because it's not adopting as many X antibody pieces to be able to constantly cycle itself, just because they're adopting for speed rather than consistency. So that also is a driving force, and green is notorious for being one of the least consistent colors, so that's a contributing factor to it. But like it's kind of like taking a similar style of approach to Red Hybrid's Ancient OTK in a way, where it's just like it's actually not a very consistent deck, even though red has some decent consistency to it. But just getting its pieces and getting into its setup is the hardest part of that deck, and the same sentiment is true with Grandis.
Well, definitely.
But there's just a whole bunch of other decks that have done really well just without looking at the lists. Blue Flares still had a couple of tops here and there. I think it had, how many tops did it have total? It had a small handful. But Blue Flares is still showing up. Even though we are not in a go wide meta and that deck wants to go wide, especially against decks that are using Gazimon to shut
Well,
it off. It's still doing well against those.
well, Psychmon, not Gaze. It never cared for
Oh,
Gaze.
Psychmon.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's true, because it's not... Well, the only thing Gazi shuts off is the memory boost, but...
Yeah, and they really don't care because you're feeding their Sora Joe, and that's nothing for them. But you also have to take into account the reason the deck still does good is because OTK decks sometimes still need a little more setup than your opponent's ready for. And as long as you can get that little stun going because they had to play 2 searchers down, instantly go wham bam, Shazam, and then you kind of just lock down those little guys for a couple turns. And then as long as you can get it to survive, those Digimon aren't going anywhere anytime soon, and that's just permanent lockdown that you're just gaining value off of all the time.
And that's why there was also like a blue hybrids that managed to squeak in, at least in other territories. Just
But
because
those aren't real territories if you ask like any of the bigger players.
I... The quality of other territories aside, it still is something to pull from. It's not the greatest of data to use, but it's still something to kind of show, like, sometimes it just takes the right run of the right deck in order to just do well with virtually almost anything you could think of. Like, again, in other territories, Beelstar did well, Ancient Greymon, hybrids, right? Hybrid OTK did well. But for the most part, as far as like what the meta is, it's still just the same core decks that have been winning over and over again, which is just Metal Garurumon, Bloom Hydra, Security Control, War Greymon. You do have a little bit of D Brigades in here. It did do well in other territories. It also did well one event here, but as Ride said before, it was at the beginning of the meta, and now that Garurumon is the meta, and there's more of them running around, it's just harder for those types of decks to win because those are the decks that they generally lose to.
Yeah, bouncing your stuff out of here and just going yeet is just really, really a drawback for D Brigade. And building stacks doesn't matter to them because nothing of your stuff, you're not really meant to stay in raising with that deck ever. You got to be just constantly spitting things out, and they just bounce whatever goes on board. So that's kind of like your drawback punishment.
Yeah, and then you still have older decks, like I mentioned, Imperial, more specifically the blue-green version of Imperial, just a very well-rounded, solid deck. And if they just are on point, they could still draw a lot of cards, deal a lot of damage. Similarly to Armor Rush, they're kind of like, I don't want to say one and the same, but they're doing very similar things, using a lot of similar cards. Armor Rush, obviously, just if it could get up fast enough into Magna and just sit on Magna, that's the real strength of the deck, is just the ability to redirect. And I think that also just applies to Bloom Hydra adopting a lot of Cherrymons for that same style and specific reason, because Cherrymon plus Hydramon out is like, yeah, just you're not getting through, you're not touching me, and you're going to be losing memory and passing your turn for your one attack.
Pretty much.
But I'm curious to see where the rest of this meta is actually going to go and develop, see what we are capable of, and like in terms of getting decks to top. I know we're just talking about like, oh, these are just the off decks that aren't necessarily going to top as often. There's still fun topics to bring up and talk about every now and then, just because it's like, oh my god, this deck topped? How on earth did they manage that? And then that becomes the story of the event versus, oh, Metal Gurumon took first place again. Whatever, who cares? It's just more exciting to talk about these underdogs at times and how they can handle the meta. So as far as like what the meta is, knowing all of this, that you're gonna have to be prepared for Metal Garurumon, Bloom Hydra, Security Control, and Wargrey. It's like that's a lot of different decks doing some very different things to be able to prepare for. So you just have to figure out where you are in that rock, paper, scissors. I honestly think if your deck can handle Metal Guru and Security Control relatively well, you should be in a good enough position deck wise to feel comfortable with your off deck being good enough to compete.
Well, that's the problem. Most decks can't do both.
Yeah. Never said that was the case. Yes. Most decks don't have the ability to handle both.
Yeah, if your deck can do it, you should be the tier 1 deck of the format.
Uh, I, we just got to figure that out. I don't think it's plausible, but I don't know. Having some hope beats getting lucky and just having a good run.
Yeah.
Because right now, that's kind of what these events kind of just feel like. We already know what the meta is, and it's just like we just need the good run in order to have the ability to have a good victory. Wargrey X has a good matchup. Yeah, that's kind of why Wargrey X is like thinking about it now. That is kind of why Wargrey X is in that top echelon, is because it does have the good matchups into both of those, but it still also struggles like Bloom Hydra on certain other matchups that might not be necessarily within the top four. Because you do also have to prepare for the unexpected, which is where these types of decks shine.
Yeah.
I'm just going over some of the data that was provided so graciously by the Reddits. As far as the evolution of our meta goes, like we said last week, we're in this consolidation phase where the known decks are just known, and I don't necessarily see many more spicy decks popping up that are unknown. It's not like a 4 Great Dragons is just going to magically come out of the woodworks and just take a top 16. That would be cool, though. Imagine that headline. But yeah, any other thoughts, Ride? As far as the meta decks that you want to mention?
Nothing really outside of the ordinary here. Most of it is just now people are playing the waiting game at this point to go like, is Nats going to be EX3 or is it going to be, BT11? And that's like what everybody's kind of just on the fence of. And I know that it is causing also a lot of player burnout. I noticed that because the formats are just how they are. A lot of people are struggling to keep up with a longer format, and especially since it is BT 9.75 here at this point. That's just really a disheartening drawback.
Yeah, it would have been nice to at least have Crosshearts in the meta, because I think Crosshearts as a deck without the we could live with the restriction of Sunrise, but it was really the Cross 4 hit that kind of just kneecapped the deck, and without its existence changed our meta dramatically, because now we don't have a high prevalence of Death X, because Death X doesn't do anything in this format.
Nope.
And as a result, a lot of decks that were also good into Crosshearts just aren't getting played, period. Which is why Skull Knight is absent. It's why Minerva Loop is absent. Just various other decks that basically worked.
Well, let's be honest, Minerva Loop was absent even when Crossheart was a thing.
No, she had one win. I'll give her one victory she deserved.
I'm giving you a glower because of that. I'm like, boy, we ain't going there. That was probably in a Europe country. It wasn't a United States tournament.
I would have to double check the data on that, but I could swear she had at least one win. It was in the lower top 16, but again,
So she
she was
just got there.
yes, but again, she is a byproduct of a format where it preys upon specific types of decks, and Cross Hearts was that specific type of deck. And without Cross Hearts, now she basically is non existent because she does absolutely terrible into everything that's currently getting played. Uh, she does bad against go wide decks, which Bloom Lord is the best go wide deck we currently have. And against OTK decks, even though they play into her strength of having a low Digimon count for the opponent, they just don't care. They're not playing anything where that would make them afraid of her. So they just honestly don't care. So they're not even feeding her into her strategy. So um, decks like those just don't exist because Cross Hearts is absent.
Very much true. But we'll have to see going forwards what small changes can happen. And to be honest with you, we'll probably see an announcement on a restriction list in January just because of how they operate.
Yeah.
Some sort of kill list, and we probably know a few major targets on their back kind of cards.
Yeah. I think that right now the stigma and perception of how good Black War Greymon has been doing in Japan, he's been running amok in Japan. And they'll be what on set 13 by the time we're on our set 11, which sounds like a lot, but they get stuff again faster and earlier than we do, so they're gonna also see EX4 in between all of that. So they still have a lot of stuff to
What do you
take
mean
a look at.
EX4? That does nothing.
I I'm saying they still are seeing multiple sets before we see our BT11. So they have multiple points in the future to pull from for us to be able to make certain types of ban and restriction decisions. Because again, Bandai bans as of right now based on Japanese data and results. Even though that could be a good thing or a bad thing for us, that's what they go with and go by. So,
Which is true. Which I hopefully they nip in the butt where things need to be nipped in the butt.
yeah, but we're in EX3 for the long haul, till February, which is one of the longer formats. I really kind of hope they stop doing this whole feast or famine thing where it's just like, here's 1 month, and then 3 months, and then 1 month. Like, what's wrong with the math to get it to 2 months? It doesn't seem that hard.
Well, I mean, don't get me wrong. I'm actually happy that there's a wider gap this time between EX and the main set, because now this is giving everybody time to go like, well, I don't have to worry about buying cards in the holiday. I now can just store up and save some cash there. And now what I can do after all my Christmas money comes in, I can just put it aside ready for the next set.
Yeah. And BT11 looks like it's going to be another powerful set that's actually going to shake up the meta, not pretend to shake up the meta like we've seen with BT10, but that was more of the banning, the early banning, more than the set itself, just because, again, Cross Hearts actually being a competitive deck does change the landscape on what we needed to play and what we are playing. And without it, we just reverted back to basically what we had with BT8. We just reverted back into BT7. We're seeing that same style of approach here where it's just like, okay, these aren't that much better or that great, so let's just play the better decks from the last format because that's what's working with a couple of new spice here and there.
Oh, definitely.
But yeah, that kind of effect would cause some burnout, uh, as expected. So It's just a matter of figuring out how we could advance the meta from here, or if this is just what the meta is. I don't know. Do they usually have any events like in January? Because I think after this December event, there's going to be no more events at least until next year.
Yes, there's nothing coming to the board.
Wow.
So
Outside of
they
locals.
yeah, outside of locals, store champions, but nobody takes those seriously in results because
Well, store champ. Yeah.
they're
Store
just glorified
championships are
locals.
done. I don't think there's going to be any more, but as far as like locals, yeah, nobody in America cares about local level data.
No, they haven't for a while. Also, like Europe has one more regional, maybe another one before they seal up too, but that could always change because Europe kind of does things a little differently than us. They don't celebrate the same holidays as us. So, that's a big difference in data too.
Yeah. I mean, each of the different regions generally has their own little play style that they generally favor over others. It's just with US being the largest and known, in quotation marks, in my opinion, known stronger, more competitive places. That's why we generally on this podcast take a look more specifically at that hardcore English gun-toting American goodness.
Yep. Well, I care more about the Japanese stuff because hey, it's usually better than what we have.
Their data points definitely are a lot different than ours. They don't have any large events. If anyone is at this point unfamiliar, they mostly favor those local level events, and their aggregates on that is more prevalence based. Um, just because like there's 500 events, and of these 500 events, what won? Um, that speaks more volumes for them than it does for us because we're like, yeah, but it didn't win the Ultimate Cup that had 512 people. That to us is a
Well,
more true testament of how good a deck is, just
well,
because of the
thing
play differences.
well, things with JP and English, one they are best of one setting majority of the time. Um and they're still restrictive on COVID interaction. They do miniature online events, but they don't ever go exceedingly high for player count. I think their max is like 32 generally for their OT cups, which makes it, oh, hey, look, I can get a metal, I can get an Omnimon from an OT cup. Wow, I got this Omnimon here that only had to play 5 rounds. Let's go.
Yeah, but as far as some of like the Japanese decks, they had definitely a slightly different spread in where things fell in their meta, obviously because their meta is different. Some of the decks that they had some success with was Darknightmon. But again, that was more because Cross Hearts was a deck that it kind of favored into. They also had Grandis because again, security control wasn't very prevalent because again, Cross Hearts kind of farms security control. Um, Machinedramon did better in Japan, but again, different environment. What else did pretty good in Japan? Link Dragons actually did a lot better than what most people would expect in Japan. I think that just might be like a fan favorite. It's like one of the more spicier, exciting decks that came out of EX3. It's definitely fun. But outside of that, there wasn't really anything hugely different. Jesmon was at least seen over there versus here. So there's still just a lot of different playable decks that can do well. It's just if you're not within those like that top four, top five decks that make up what the meta is, then you just have to figure out which one you're going to see more of and then hope to farm it.
Yeah.
And that's kind of like how I feel like a lot of these lesser decks do well is just being able to farm the top 4 decks, pick your matchup, and then just learn it and be able to adapt to that one specific matchup that you feel like would be the most prevalent thing that you would see.
Hmm. You're not wrong. Those are very valid points.
But yeah. So, any closing thoughts? Because I think we are hitting time soon.
Yeah. Nothing really. We kind of just covered majority of it. We're in the long haul for this. There's nothing else we can really do about it. So be ready to just take on with Storm, right?
Yeah, pretty much. And just because you're not playing one of the top tier decks doesn't mean your deck doesn't have the ability to win. Is kind of like the sentiment that I wanted to get at. You just have to understand how to be able to get yourself into that position. It's going to be different per deck, but it is definitely plausible, as we've seen, for even some of these older decks to do well. Um, but that is it for this episode. Special thanks to anyone who stuck all the way to the end. I know Nako is currently taking a bit of a break, so he should be back next time. I want to thank and shout out RideMyAvatar. Go follow him on his various social media platforms and his YouTube/Twitch for coming in and taking up the mantle in his absence.
Yeah, no problem. Anytime you need help, I can help as long as I'm not busy. But it's good to be on here. This was a really fun discussion and we had a decent back and forth. And I got to say, it was really useful, insightful. And hopefully everybody kind of got some decent worth out of this content, you know?
Yep. And with that, goodbye.
Hasta luego.